Between 1935 and 1938, 12 dismembered bodies were discovered in Cleveland, Ohio. 12 victims, 12 families destroyed, and one killer who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only severed torsos and a city paralyzed by fear. The methodical precision of the dismemberments suggested surgical knowledge. The killer's ability to evade capture despite one of the largest investigations in Cleveland's history suggested something far more terrifying than random violence. This was calculated. This was systematic. And after nearly 9 decades, it remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a criminal profiler who has spent the last 15 years studying serial homicides. I've analyzed hundreds of cases, from Ted Bundy to the Zodiac Killer. But the Cleveland torso murders present behavioral patterns so unique, so methodically executed, that they challenge everything we thought we knew about serial killing. What I've discovered through modern forensic analysis and psychological profiling techniques will fundamentally change how you understand this case. The killer they call the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run didn't just murder his victims. He surgically dismembered them with a precision that suggests medical training, then displayed their remains in specific locations throughout Cleveland's industrial landscape. The pattern wasn't random. The locations weren't coincidental. And the killer's ability to operate undetected for nearly 4 years suggests a level of planning and intelligence that places him among the most sophisticated predators in criminal history. Tonight, we're going to examine this case through the lens of modern criminal psychology. We'll explore the behavioral evidence that previous investigators missed, analyze the killer's signature through contemporary profiling techniques, and reveal why this case represents a turning point in our understanding of organized serial murder. Because what happened in Cleveland between 1935 and 1938 wasn't just a series of killings. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, executed by a predator so cunning that he managed to terrorize an entire city while remaining completely invisible. The first discovery came on September 5, 1935, when 2 young boys playing near the Erie Railroad tracks in Kingsbury Run stumbled upon something that would haunt Cleveland for decades. What they found wasn't just a body. It was 2 lower torsos, completely severed at the waist, drained of blood, and positioned with deliberate care. The precision of the cuts immediately suggested someone with anatomical knowledge. But it was the positioning of the remains that revealed something far more disturbing. From a behavioral analysis perspective, the killer's choice to place these first remains in Kingsbury Run was strategically brilliant. This area of Cleveland was a Depression-era shantytown, inhabited by transients, homeless individuals, and people society had forgotten. It was a perfect hunting ground for a predator seeking victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. But more importantly, it was a location that allowed the killer to display his work while maintaining the anonymity he needed to continue killing. The medical examiner's report on these first victims revealed details that the original investigators couldn't fully appreciate without modern forensic psychology. Both victims had been decapitated, and their limbs removed with surgical precision. The cuts were clean, made with sharp instruments, and showed evidence of anatomical knowledge. But what the investigators in 1935 couldn't understand was that this level of dismemberment served multiple psychological purposes for the killer. First, it satisfied what we now recognize as a need for complete domination over his victims. By reducing human beings to anonymous body parts, the killer was exercising the ultimate form of control. Second, the methodical nature of the dismemberment suggests someone who derived satisfaction from the process itself. This wasn't simply a method of disposal or concealment. This was part of the killer's signature, a ritualistic behavior that fulfilled deep psychological needs. The investigation that followed will be led by Cleveland Safety Director Eliot Ness, the same man who had brought down Al Capone in Chicago. Ness approached the case with the same methodical determination that had made him famous during Prohibition. He assembled a team of the city's best detectives, consulted with medical experts, and implemented investigative techniques that were revolutionary for their time. But despite his reputation and resources, Ness would find himself facing an adversary unlike any he had encountered before. What made this killer so difficult to catch wasn't just his ability to select victims who wouldn't be missed. It was his understanding of police procedure and his ability to stay ahead of the investigation. Every piece of evidence seemed calculated to mislead. Every discovery raised more questions than it answered. And every time the police thought they were closing in, the killer would demonstrate that he was not only watching their investigation, but actively manipulating it. The second and third victims were discovered on September 23, 1935, in the same area of Kingsbury Run. This time, the remains included a complete male torso and the decapitated head of another victim. The killer had escalated his display, becoming bolder in his presentations. But from a psychological perspective, what's most significant about these discoveries is what they reveal about the killer's evolving relationship with law enforcement and the media. By this point, the Cleveland newspapers were covering the story extensively. The killer had gained the attention he craved, and his response was to become more theatrical in his displays. The head found with the second and third victims was positioned facing upward, as if watching the sky. This wasn't random positioning. In criminal psychology, we recognize this type of staging as communication. The killer was sending a message, not just to law enforcement, but to the entire city of Cleveland. The precision of the dismemberments continued to suggest medical or anatomical knowledge, but modern analysis reveals something even more disturbing. The killer wasn't just familiar with human anatomy. He understood exactly how to disassemble a human body in a way that would create maximum psychological impact while providing minimum forensic evidence. This suggests someone who had not only studied anatomy, but had specifically studied forensic medicine and police procedure. The fourth victim, discovered in February 1936, marked a significant escalation in the killer's methodology. This time, the remains were found in a basket behind a Cleveland butcher shop, and they included parts from multiple victims. The killer was now not only displaying his work more boldly, but was beginning to mix and match body parts from different murders. From a psychological perspective, this behavior indicates a killer who is becoming increasingly confident and who is beginning to view his victims not as individuals, but as raw material for his increasingly elaborate displays. The location of this discovery, behind a butcher shop, was particularly significant. It wasn't coincidental. The killer was making a statement about his view of his victims and his work. In his mind, he wasn't murdering people. He was processing them, just like the butcher processed meat. This dehumanization is a classic characteristic of organized serial killers, but the theatrical way this killer expressed it was unique. The investigation intensified dramatically after the fourth victim. Eliot Ness brought in additional resources, including federal agents and consulting criminologists. They established a task force dedicated exclusively to the torso murders, implemented new identification techniques, and began one of the most comprehensive investigations in Cleveland's history. But the killers seemed to anticipate every move they made. What's particularly fascinating from a behavioral analysis perspective is how the killer adapted his methods in response to increased police attention. Rather than stopping or becoming more careful, he became more creative. The fifth and sixth victims, discovered in June 1936, showed evidence of a killer who was not only undeterred by the investigation, but was actively challenging law enforcement to catch him. These victims were found in Kingsbury Run again, but this time the killer had introduced a new element to his signature. The bodies showed evidence of having been kept alive for an extended period before death. Rope marks on the remains suggested the victims had been bound, and the condition of the tissues indicated they had been held for weeks rather than killed immediately after abduction. This evolution in the killer's methodology reveals several important psychological factors. First, he was becoming more comfortable with his killing process and was taking more time to satisfy his psychological needs. Second, he was developing what we now recognize as a torture-murder pattern, suggesting that the act of causing suffering was becoming as important to him as the killing itself. And third, he was demonstrating an ability to maintain secure holding locations where he could keep victims alive without detection. The implications of this evolution are terrifying. The killer had progressed from opportunistic murders to carefully planned abductions and extended torture scenarios. He had secure locations where he could work undisturbed, and he had developed the psychological stamina to maintain this level of violence over extended periods. These are characteristics we typically associate with the most dangerous and sophisticated serial killers in history. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the killer's apparent enjoyment of the police investigation itself. Evidence suggests he was following media coverage closely and was modifying his methods specifically to confound investigators. The positioning of remains began to show patterns that seemed designed to mislead profilers. The timing of discoveries appeared calculated to maximize media attention, and the killer began leaving what appeared to be deliberate clues that led investigators down dead-end paths. The seventh victim, discovered in July 1936, represented the peak of the killer's psychological game playing with law enforcement. The remains were found in the Cuyahoga River, but they had been weighted down in a way that ensured they would surface exactly when and where the killer intended. The timing coincided with a major press conference that Eliot Ness had scheduled to update the public on the investigation's progress. From a criminal psychology perspective, this timing couldn't have been coincidental. The killer was demonstrating that he was not only aware of the investigation schedule, but was actively manipulating it. He was forcing law enforcement to react to his timeline, rather than pursuing their own investigative strategy. This level of psychological manipulation indicates a killer with not just above-average intelligence, but with specific knowledge of police procedure and media operations. The condition of the seventh victim also revealed new aspects of the killer's evolving signature. The dismemberment was more elaborate than previous victims, with evidence of experimentation in cutting techniques. The killer was refining his methods, treating each murder as an opportunity to perfect his craft. This suggests someone who took professional pride in his work and who was constantly seeking to improve his techniques. But it was a discovery of the eighth and ninth victims in September 1936 that revealed the true scope of the killer's psychological sophistication. These remains were found in two separate locations on the same day, positioned in a way that created a coordinated law enforcement response. While police and media attention was focused on one discovery site, evidence at the second site was being compromised by weather and time. This level of strategic thinking indicates a killer who understood not just police procedure, but resource allocation and media behavior. He knew exactly how law enforcement would respond to multiple crime scenes and was using this knowledge to control the investigation. The killer had moved beyond simply evading capture. He was actively directing the investigation according to his own psychological needs. The psychological profile that emerges from these discoveries is of a killer unlike any other in the annals of criminal history. This was someone with medical or anatomical training, detailed knowledge of police procedure, understanding of media operations, and the psychological sophistication to maintain a complex game of cat and mouse with law enforcement for over a year. But perhaps most importantly, this was someone who derived as much satisfaction from manipulating the investigation as he did from the murders themselves. The 10th victim, discovered in February 1937, marked another significant escalation in the killer's methodology. This time, the remains showed evidence of chemical preservation techniques. The killer had treated parts of the body with substances that prevented normal decomposition, suggesting not just anatomical knowledge, but expertise in mortuary science or pathology. This development indicates a killer who was constantly expanding his skill set and who viewed each murder as an opportunity for experimentation. The use of preservation chemicals also suggests someone with access to medical or mortuary supplies, which provided investigators with their first real lead about the killer's professional background. However, when police began investigating medical professionals, morticians, and anatomy instructors in the Cleveland area, the killer seemed to anticipate their approach. The 11th victim, discovered in June 1937, showed evidence of deliberate contamination designed to compromise forensic analysis. The killer had introduced foreign substances that would interfere with standard toxicology tests and had positioned the remains in environmental conditions that would degrade DNA evidence. This level of forensic awareness was unprecedented in 1937. The killer was demonstrating knowledge of investigative techniques that were considered cutting-edge at the time. He understood not just how to commit murder, but how to ensure that the evidence would be useless to investigators. This suggests someone who was not only studying police procedure, but was actively researching forensic science and staying ahead of investigative technology. The final confirmed victim of the Mad Butcher was discovered in August 1938, but this discovery was different from all the others. Instead of being found in Kingsbury Run or the industrial areas where previous victims had been discovered, this body was found in a location that directly challenged law enforcement's authority and competence. The remains were discovered on the front steps of Cleveland City Hall, positioned in a way that would be immediately visible to anyone entering the building. This wasn't just another murder. This was a direct taunt to Eliot Ness and the entire Cleveland Police Department. The killer was demonstrating that he could place his work anywhere he chose, even in the most secure and symbolic locations in the city. From a psychological perspective, this final display represents the culmination of the killer's relationship with law enforcement. He had spent 3 years demonstrating his superiority over the investigation, and this last victim was his ultimate statement of dominance. The killer was declaring victory and showing that he could end his killing spree on his own terms, at a time and place of his choosing. But what happened next reveals perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of this entire case. After depositing the 12th victim at City Hall, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run simply vanished. There were no more murders fitting his signature, no more carefully positioned remains, no more taunts to law enforcement. The killer had achieved whatever psychological satisfaction he sought from his 3-year reign of terror, and he simply stopped. This type of voluntary cessation is extremely rare among serial killers. Most continue killing until they're caught, killed, or physically unable to continue. The fact that the Mad Butcher was able to stop killing entirely suggests a level of self-control and goal-oriented behavior that places him in a category shared by very few serial offenders in history. But the killer's disappearance raises questions that continue to haunt criminal psychologists today. Did he actually stop killing, or did he simply move to a different location and modify his methods? Did he achieve whatever psychological goal had motivated his killing spree, or was this cessation due to external factors that forced him to stop? And most disturbing of all, did he view his 3 years of terror in Cleveland as merely a practice run for something even more ambitious? The investigation continued for years after the last murder, with Eliot Ness pursuing hundreds of leads and interviewing thousands of suspects. The most promising suspect was a man named Frank Dolezal, who was arrested in 1939 and initially confessed to several of the murders. However, Dolezal's confession contained numerous inconsistencies and factual errors that suggested he was either mentally unstable or had been coerced into making false statements. More importantly, from a behavioral analysis perspective, Dolezal didn't fit the psychological profile of the killer. He lacked the medical knowledge, the strategic thinking ability, and the psychological sophistication that characterized the real Mad Butcher. When Dolezal died in police custody under suspicious circumstances, many investigators believed they had lost their only solid suspect. But modern criminal psychology suggests they had never had the real killer at all. The true Mad Butcher possessed characteristics that made him nearly impossible to catch using 1930s investigative techniques. He was highly intelligent, methodically careful, and possessed specialized knowledge that allowed him to stay ahead of the investigation. He understood human psychology well enough to select victims who wouldn't be missed and to manipulate media coverage for his own purposes. And he had the self-discipline to stop killing when he achieved whatever goal had motivated his crimes. From a modern criminological perspective, the Cleveland torso murders represent a watershed moment in the evolution of serial killing. The Mad Butcher demonstrated techniques and psychological sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the emergence of killers like Ted Bundy and Dennis Rader decades later. He was, in many ways, the first truly modern serial killer. The case also represents a turning point in criminal investigation techniques. Eliot Ness and his team pioneered several investigative methods that would become standard procedure in serial killer cases. They established the first true multi-jurisdictional task force, implemented systematic evidence collection and analysis procedures, and began using psychological profiling techniques that were revolutionary for their time. But perhaps most importantly, the Cleveland torso murders demonstrated the limitations of traditional police work when dealing with highly intelligent, psychologically sophisticated offenders. The killer's ability to manipulate the investigation, control media coverage, and ultimately escape justice on his own terms showed that law enforcement needed to develop new approaches to deal with this type of criminal. The impact on Cleveland itself was profound and long-lasting. The city's reputation was severely damaged by the 3 years of terror and the police department's inability to solve the case. Property values in affected neighborhoods plummeted, tourism declined, and the city's sense of security was shattered in a way that took decades to repair. But the psychological impact on individual residents was even more devastating. Hundreds of people reported symptoms of anxiety, depression, and paranoia that persisted long after the killing stopped. The killer had achieved something that few criminals in history have managed. He had terrorized an entire major city and fundamentally changed how its residents viewed their own safety and security. The families of the victims face unique challenges that continue to this day. Because many of the victims were never fully identified, families across the country spent decades wondering if their missing relatives had fallen victim to the Mad Butcher. The lack of closure, combined with the sensational media coverage, created a form of prolonged psychological trauma that affected multiple generations. From a sociological perspective, the Cleveland torso murders occurred during a period of significant social and economic upheaval. The Great Depression had created large populations of transient, vulnerable individuals who were ideal victims for a predator like the Mad Butcher. The killer understood and exploited these social conditions with sophistication that suggests not just psychological intelligence, but sociological awareness. The killer's selection of victims reveals a cold-blooded understanding of social hierarchies and law enforcement priorities. By targeting individuals on the margins of society, he ensured that the investigations would receive less resources and attention than if he had killed more prominent citizens. When investigations did intensify, he had already established patterns and methods that made him nearly impossible to catch. Modern DNA analysis has been applied to evidence from several of the Cleveland torso murders, but the killer's use of chemicals and a sophisticated understanding of forensic contamination has made it impossible to develop a usable genetic profile. This represents one of the most frustrating aspects of the case for contemporary investigators. Even with technology that the original killer could never have imagined, his careful evidence destruction techniques continue to protect his identity. However, recent advances in forensic anthropology have revealed new information about the killer's methods and possible background. Analysis of the cut marks on the bones has confirmed that the killer used surgical quality instruments and possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy. The precision and consistency of the cuts across all 12 victims suggests someone with extensive hands-on experience with human dissection. This evidence has led modern investigators to focus on individuals with medical training, particularly those with experience in pathology, surgery, or mortuary science. The killer's ability to perform complex dismemberments quickly and efficiently suggests someone who has performed similar procedures many times before, either in a medical or mortuary setting. But the psychological evidence continues to suggest that the Mad Butcher was far more than simply a medical professional who had turned to murder. The strategic thinking, media manipulation, and investigation control demonstrated throughout the case indicates someone with interests and expertise that extended far beyond medical training. One theory that has gained credence among modern criminologists is that the killer may have been involved in law enforcement or military intelligence. His understanding of police procedure, his ability to predict investigative responses, and his skill at evidence contamination suggests someone with insider knowledge of law enforcement operations. This theory is supported by the killer's apparent access to information about the investigation's progress and his ability to stay ahead of police efforts. Several pieces of evidence suggest that the killer was receiving information about investigative activities, possibly from sources within the police department itself. The military intelligence connection is suggested by the killer's strategic thinking and his ability to maintain operational security over an extended period. The 3-year duration of the killing spree, combined with the killer's ability to maintain secure operating locations and avoid detection, suggests training in covert operations that was more commonly found in military or intelligence contexts than in civilian life. However, these theories remain speculative, and the true identity of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run continues to elude investigators. What we can say with certainty is that he represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated serial killers in American history, and his case continues to influence how we understand and investigate similar crimes today. The Cleveland torso murders also had a significant impact on the development of criminal profiling as an investigative tool. The case was one of the first to demonstrate the value of psychological analysis in understanding criminal behavior, and many of the profiling techniques developed during the investigation became standard practices in serial killer cases. Eliot Ness himself became one of the early advocates for psychological profiling, recognizing that traditional detective work was insufficient for catching killers as sophisticated as the Mad Butcher. His collaboration with psychiatrists and psychologists during the investigation helped establish the foundation for what would eventually become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The case also demonstrated the importance of understanding a killer's psychological signature versus their method of operation. While the Mad Butcher's methods evolved and became more sophisticated over time, his psychological signature remained consistent. The need for complete domination, the desire for recognition, and the compulsion to control and manipulate the investigation itself. This distinction between signature and method of operation has become fundamental to modern serial killer investigations. It allows investigators to recognize crimes committed by the same offender even when the specific techniques used may vary, and provides insight into the psychological motivations that drive the killer's behavior. The media coverage of the Cleveland torso murders also established patterns that continue to influence how serial killer cases are reported today. The sensational headlines, the focus on the killer's perceived intelligence and sophistication, and the public fascination with the investigation's failures all became template elements that appear in virtually every major serial killer case. But the media coverage also served the killer's psychological needs in ways that contemporary journalists couldn't understand. The Mad Butcher clearly followed media reports about his crimes and used them to gauge public and law enforcement response. The attention and notoriety fed his narcissistic needs and may have been a significant factor in motivating him to continue killing. This relationship between serial killers and media coverage has become a critical concern for modern law enforcement. Investigators now understand that excessive media attention can actually encourage and prolong serial killing by providing the recognition and validation that many of these killers crave. The Cleveland case was also significant in demonstrating how serial killers can use media coverage to communicate with law enforcement and the public. The Mad Butcher's increasingly theatrical displays were clearly designed to generate specific types of media coverage, and his timing of discoveries to coincide with press conferences and public events showed that he was actively manipulating media narratives. This understanding has led to the development of media management strategies that are now standard in serial killer investigations. Law enforcement agencies work closely with media outlets to ensure that coverage doesn't inadvertently assist a killer or compromise the investigation. The economic impact of the Cleveland torso murders was also significant and long-lasting. The 3 years of terror coincided with Cleveland's efforts to recover from the Great Depression, and the negative publicity surrounding the unsolved murders severely hampered these recovery efforts. Tourism, which had been beginning to recover in the mid-1930s, declined dramatically as the murders gained national attention. Business investment in the affected areas of the city virtually ceased, and the cost of the investigation itself, which involved hundreds of officers and federal agents over nearly 4 years, represented a significant drain on the city's resources. The case also had implications for urban planning and development. The areas where most of the murders occurred, particularly Kingsbury Run, were eventually completely redeveloped in efforts to eliminate the transient populations that had made ideal hunting grounds for killer. While this may have improved conditions for legitimate residents, it also displaced vulnerable populations to other areas where they remained potential victims for future predators. From a contemporary perspective, the Cleveland torso murders raise important questions about how society protects its most vulnerable members. The killer's ability to target transient and homeless individuals with impunity highlighted societal indifference to these populations that continues to be a problem today. Modern homeless advocacy groups often cite the Cleveland case as an example of how law enforcement response can vary dramatically depending on the social status of victims. While the murders eventually received extensive investigation, the initial response was relatively limited because the victims were not considered important members of society. This selective attention to victims based on social status remains a significant issue in contemporary serial killer investigations. Killers who target prostitutes, homeless individuals, or other marginalized populations often operate for extended periods before their crimes receive serious attention from law enforcement. The Cleveland case also demonstrates the importance of interagency cooperation in serial killer investigations. The Mad Butcher operated across multiple jurisdictions, and the initial lack of coordination between different police departments may have contributed to his ability to evade capture. Eliot Ness's establishment of a coordinated task force was revolutionary for its time and became the model for how complex serial killer investigations are conducted today. The sharing of information, resources, and expertise across jurisdictional boundaries is now recognized as essential for catching sophisticated serial offenders. But the case also revealed the limitations of even the most comprehensive investigations when dealing with highly intelligent and psychologically sophisticated killers. Despite unprecedented resources, cutting-edge investigative techniques, and the personal attention of one of America's most famous law enforcement officers, the Mad Butcher was never identified or captured. This failure has had lasting implications for how law enforcement approaches serial killer cases. It demonstrated that traditional detective work, no matter how thorough or well-resourced, may be insufficient for catching killers who possess superior intelligence and specialized knowledge. The development of psychological profiling, forensic science, and computer-assisted investigation techniques can all be traced, in part, to lessons learned from cases like the Cleveland torso murders. Law enforcement recognized that they needed new tools and approaches to deal with killers who could outthink and outmaneuver traditional investigation methods. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Cleveland torso murders is what the case reveals about the nature of evil itself. The Mad Butcher represented a type of criminal that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human behavior and morality. This was not a killer driven by passion, desperation, or mental illness in any conventional sense. This was someone who systematically planned and executed a campaign of terror for purely psychological gratification. The level of calculation, sophistication, and self-control demonstrated throughout the case suggests a form of evil that is both more rare and more dangerous than the impulsive violence that characterizes most criminal behavior. The killer's ability to stop killing voluntarily when he achieved whatever psychological satisfaction he sought suggests that his 3-year reign of terror was essentially recreational. He killed because he enjoyed it, because it fulfilled deep psychological needs, and because he could demonstrate his superiority over law enforcement and society. This type of purely predatory behavior, unconstrained by normal human empathy or moral considerations, represents one of the most frightening aspects of human nature. The Mad Butcher showed that some individuals are capable of viewing other human beings as nothing more than objects for their own gratification and entertainment. But the case also demonstrates the resilience of communities and the dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to give up in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Eliot Ness and his team may not have caught the Mad Butcher, but their investigation established procedures and techniques that have helped catch countless other killers in the decades since. The families and friends of the victims showed remarkable strength and dignity in the face of unimaginable loss and the frustration of never receiving justice. Their demands for answers and their refusal to let their loved ones be forgotten helped maintain pressure on law enforcement and kept the case in the public eye. And the citizens of Cleveland, despite being terrorized for 3 years, ultimately refused to be defeated by the killer's campaign of fear. The city recovered, rebuilt, and moved forward, proving that even the most sophisticated predator cannot permanently destroy the human spirit. Today, nearly 9 decades after the first discovery in Kingsbury Run, the Cleveland torso murders continue to fascinate criminologists, investigators, and the general public. The case represents a perfect storm of criminal sophistication, investigative challenges, and societal impact that may never be duplicated. But for those of us who study criminal behavior, the case serves as a constant reminder of how much we still don't understand about the human capacity for evil. The Mad Butcher demonstrated levels of intelligence, planning, and psychological sophistication that force us to completely revise our understanding of what serial killers are capable of achieving. The fact that he was never caught, despite one of the most intensive investigations in American history, proves that there are criminals operating at levels of sophistication that continue to challenge our investigative capabilities. Even with all our advances in forensic science, criminal profiling, and investigative technology, there may still be killers out there who possess the intelligence and skills necessary to evade justice indefinitely. The Cleveland torso murders remind us that the war between law enforcement and criminal predators is an ongoing battle that requires constant innovation, dedication, and vigilance. The Mad Butcher may have won his particular campaign, but his case has educated and prepared investigators to deal with similar challenges in the future. As we continue to study this case and others like it, We honor the memory of the 12 victims who lost their lives to satisfy one man's twisted psychological needs. We remember that behind every statistic, every case file, and every investigative failure, there are real people whose lives were cut short by evil. And we maintain our commitment to ensuring that future predators like the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run will not be able to operate with the same impunity. Through continued research, improved investigative techniques, and never-ending vigilance, we work to ensure that justice will ultimately prevail over even the most sophisticated criminal minds. The Cleveland torso murders may remain unsolved, but they are not forgotten. They continue to teach us, challenge us, and remind us of our responsibility to protect society's most vulnerable members from those who would prey upon them. In that sense, perhaps the Mad Butcher's ultimate victory was not as complete as he believed it to be. His crimes may have gone unpunished, but they have not gone unnoticed, and they continue to serve the cause of justice by educating those who seek to prevent similar tragedies in the future. If you're as fascinated by this case as I am, and you want to dive deeper into the psychological analysis of history's most sophisticated serial killers, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started with our exploration of the Mad Butcher's psychological profile, and what we uncover next will challenge everything you think you know about criminal behavior. Don't miss out on the psychological insights that could change how you understand not just this case, but the entire nature of predatory behavior. The patterns we're uncovering here appear in cases spanning decades, and understanding them is crucial for recognizing similar threats in the future. Before we continue with our analysis of the Mad Butcher's final victims, I want to remind you that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the most comprehensive psychological analysis of true crime cases you'll find anywhere. If you're getting value from this deep dive into criminal psychology, please hit that like button to help others discover this content. We have extensive coverage of similar cases, including the Zodiac Killer's psychological manipulation techniques and the behavioral patterns that link seemingly unconnected serial murders across different decades. Each case builds on the others, creating a comprehensive understanding of how these predators think and operate. Your engagement helps us continue producing this level of detailed analysis. As we wrap up our psychological analysis of the Cleveland torso murders, I want to hear from you. Have you ever lived in an area where an unsolved serial killer case created a lasting atmosphere of fear? Do you think the Mad Butcher could have been someone in a position of authority or trust within the Cleveland community? What aspect of this case do you find most disturbing from a psychological perspective? Share your thoughts in the comment below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who's interested in understanding the psychological sophistication that makes some serial killers so difficult to catch. Your theories and insights often reveal connections that professional investigators miss. And this case, more than any other, demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are often hiding in plain sight within our communities. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run achieved something that few serial killers in history have managed. He completely controlled the narrative of his crimes from beginning to end. He selected his victims, dictated the pace of the investigation, manipulated media coverage, and ultimately decided when and how his killing spree would end. In doing so, he demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that continues to challenge our understanding of human evil nearly 9 decades later. But perhaps his greatest victory was not in evading capture, but in proving that there are forms of human predation so intelligent and methodical that they can operate with virtual impunity even in the face of society's most determined efforts to stop them. The Mad Butcher showed us that the monsters we fear most are not the obvious, impulsive killers who make mistakes and get caught. They are the quiet, calculating predators who understand human psychology better than we understand ourselves, and who use that knowledge to terrorize entire communities while remaining completely invisible. The 12 victims of the Cleveland torso murders deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in an unsolved case, but as individuals whose lives were stolen by someone who viewed them as nothing more than objects for his own gratification. Their deaths were not meaningless, because they taught us lessons about criminal behavior that continue to protect potential victims today. In that sense, perhaps justice has been served after all, not through punishment of the perpetrator, but through the prevention of similar crimes in the future. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run may have escaped earthly justice, but he cannot escape the judgment of history. His crimes live on as a testament to human evil, but but also as a challenge to human determination to understand and prevent such evil from triumphing again. In studying his case, analyzing his methods, and understanding his psychology, we honor his victims and work to ensure that their deaths were not in vain. The investigation may be cold, but the case will never be closed. As long as there are people dedicated to understanding criminal behavior and protecting the innocent, the Mad Butcher's crimes will continue to be studied, analyzed, and used to make our community safer. In that ongoing fight for justice, his ultimate victory may yet be transformed into his ultimate defeat.